In every small town, there's a place no one goes, a story everyone knows but no one speaks of, a place where childhood dares turn into adult nightmares. Tonight, we journey to the quiet town of Oakhaven, a town shattered by a mystery that remains a bleeding wound 5 years later. We're talking about the vanishing of 5 teenage girls, who walked into the shadow of the abandoned Blackwood Sanatorium and were never seen again. Their story is a chilling tapestry of fear, friendship, and a terrifying local legend that may be all too real. We've uncovered new details, eyewitness accounts, and a piece of evidence that will change everything you think you know. So, before we step into these echoes of fear, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell. You need to be here for this. The last day of their lives began with the mundane magic of a Friday in October. For the 5 girls at the center of Oakhaven's enduring nightmare, it was a day of shared secrets, cheap pizza, and the intoxicating promise of a weekend unfurling before them. The air was crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, a perfect backdrop for the ghost stories that would later seal their fate. The group was an eclectic constellation of personalities, bound together by the intense, often complicated gravity of high school friendship. At its core was Maya Ramirez, a girl with a supernova's confidence and a smile that could disarm teachers and charm rivals. It was always Maya's idea, her energy that propelled them forward, for better or worse. She was the captain of their small ship, steering them towards adventure with a reckless, magnetic grin. Her counterbalance was Chloe Chun, the pragmatist, the skeptic, the group's documentarian. Chloe viewed the world through the lens of her DSLR camera, finding comfort in shutter speeds and f-stops rather than feelings. She didn't believe in ghosts, fate, or anything that couldn't be empirically proven, but she believed in her friends, and so she went along, her camera a shield against the superstitions she found so illogical. Her role was to roll her eyes, offer a scientific explanation for every creak and groan, and, crucially, to press record. Then there was Lily Sharma, the sensitive soul, the believer. Where Chloe saw light and shadow, Lily saw omens and spirits. She was a girl woven from anxiety and folklore, her pockets often containing protective crystals, and her search history filled with local legends and occult rituals. She felt the world more deeply than the others, a trait that made her both the most empathetic and the most vulnerable. Her fear was genuine, a low hum of static beneath her quiet demeanor, and it often served as the group's early warning system. Ava Sinclair was the heart, the peacemaker. Quietly observant and unfailingly kind, Ava's mission was to ensure harmony. She navigated the turbulent waters of teenage social dynamics with a gentle diplomacy that often went unappreciated. She didn't seek the spotlight like Maya, nor challenge the narrative like Chloe, but her steady presence was the glue that held their disparate parts together. She went along not for the thrill, but for the togetherness. Finally, there was Jess Riley, the outsider who had been cautiously welcomed into the fold. Jess was all sharp edges and sarcastic armor, a defense mechanism built from a turbulent home life she never spoke about. She found a fragile sense of belonging with the others, but a part of her always remained aloof, watching from the periphery. Her cynicism was different from Chloe's. It wasn't born of logic, but of disappointment, a deep-seated belief that things and people would inevitably let you down. The plan for the night was a sleepover at Maya's house, a ritualistic gathering involving horror movies, junk food, and the dissection of school gossip. As dusk bled across the sky in hues of orange and purple, they sat huddled in Maya's basement, the glow of a slasher film flickering across their faces. It was during a particularly gruesome scene that Maya, ever the instigator, paused the movie. "This is boring," she declared, tossing a handful of popcorn into her mouth. "It's fake. We need something real." "Define real," Chloe said without looking away from her phone, where she was editing photos from the afternoon's soccer game. "Real fear. A real ghost story," Maya said, her eyes gleaming with an idea. "We should go to Blackwood." A sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. Even the fake screams from the television seemed to die away. Blackwood Sanatorium was Oakhaven's boogeyman. It stood on a hill just outside of town, a skeletal silhouette against the moon, a place of crumbling brick and shattered windows. The stories were a part of every child's upbringing. They were told of Dr. Alistair Blackwood, a physician from the 1920s who believed that fear was a tangible illness that could be surgically excised from the human mind. His methods were said to be monstrous, his patients driven to madness not by their own afflictions, but by his cures. The legend said his experiments went too far, that he had somehow created a tear in the fabric of reality, a place where the echoes of his patients' terror were trapped, replaying for eternity. The sanatorium was closed after a series of mysterious deaths and a fire that gutted the West Wing, but the stories, and the fear, remained. Lily was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't. People who go there, they get sick. They see things. My grandma said it's a place of bad energy." A wound. "Your grandma also said a black cat stole her car keys?" Jess muttered, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. "It's just an old, abandoned building," Chloe reasoned, finally looking up. "The bad energy is probably asbestos and black mold. The things people see are tricks of the light. There's a logical explanation for everything." "See? Chloe gets it," Maya said, jumping to her feet. "Think of it. The 5 of us, exploring Blackwood on the night before Halloween. It's perfect. Chloe, you can bring your camera. We'll film the whole thing. Prove once and for all that it's just a pile of bricks." The idea hung in the air, a dangerous, glittering lure. Ava looked nervously between Lily's pale face and Maya's determined one. "I don't know, Maya." "Come on, Ava. It'll be an adventure," Maya pressed, her enthusiasm infectious. "We stick together, we bring flashlights. We're in and out in an hour. What's the worst that could happen?" It was a question that would hang, unanswered, over Oakhaven for years to come. Jess, surprisingly, was the one who sealed the deal. She looked at Maya's expectant face, at the nervous energy crackling in the room, and shrugged. "Whatever. It's better than sitting here watching this garbage." For Jess, facing a potential ghost was less daunting than another night of feigned normalcy. An hour later, they were piling into Jess's beat-up sedan, the only one old enough to have a car. The trunk was loaded with a motley collection of supplies. Heavy-duty flashlights, a bag of candy, Chloe's camera bag, and a small pouch of salt that Lily had insisted on bringing, for protection. The drive out of the manicured suburbs and onto the winding country road that led to the sanatorium was quiet. The nervous excitement had been replaced by a more sober apprehension. They parked the car in a small, overgrown clearing, hidden from the main road. The sanatorium loomed before them, even more menacing up close. Its empty windows looked like vacant eye sockets, and the wind whispered through the broken panes with a sound like a mournful sigh. A rusted, wrought-iron fence surrounded the property, a section of which had been bent and pried open years ago, a permanent invitation to the foolish and the brave. "Okay," Maya said, her voice a little too loud in the oppressive silence. "Here we go. Stick together. No one wanders off." Chloe switched on her camera, the small red light a comforting, clinical presence in the gloom. "Rolling," she announced, her voice steady. She panned across the faces of her friends, illuminated by the beams of their flashlights. Maya's determined jaw, Ava's wide, nervous eyes, Lily's trembling lip, and Jess's mask of indifference. They slipped through the gap in the fence, their feet crunching on dead leaves. The path to the main entrance was choked with weeds. The grand oak doors were boarded up, but a smaller side entrance, perhaps once used by staff, hung ajar on a single, groaning hinge. The air that drifted out from the dark opening was cold and smelled of damp decay, of dust and something else, something faintly medicinal and unpleasant. "Last chance to back out," Chloe said, a hint of challenge in her voice. Maya looked at her friends, a flicker of doubt crossing her features for the first time. But then she straightened her shoulders, her bravado returning. "No way. We came this far." She pushed the door open wider, the sound of scraping metal echoing in the night. "Hello?" she called into the darkness, her voice swallowed by the immense, waiting silence within. "Is anybody home?" She took a step inside, and one by one, the others followed her across the threshold, from the familiar world of an autumn night into the suffocating, timeless dark of Blackwood Sanatorium. The heavy door swung shut behind them with a deep, final boom, plunging them into absolute blackness before their flashlights sliced through the gloom. They were inside, and the last recorded moments of their lives had begun. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Not the usual peaceful quiet of a Saturday morning in Oakhaven, but a profound, unnatural stillness. In the Ramirez household, Maria Ramirez walked into her daughter's empty bedroom at 9 a.m., a plate of pancakes in her hand, and found a perfectly made bed. Maya never made her bed. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She called Maya's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Across town, the same scene of dawning horror was playing out in 4 other homes. Calls were made, a frantic digital web of worry connecting the parents. Is Maya with you? Have you heard from Chloe? Lily isn't answering her phone. By 10:30 a.m., the knot of anxiety had become a full-blown, collective panic. They had all last seen their daughters heading to Maya's for a sleepover. But Maya's parents swore the girls had never come home after going out for what they assumed was a late-night snack run. No one knew about the change of plans. No one knew about Blackwood. By noon, the Oakhaven Police Department was involved. The initial report was for 5 missing teenage girls, a scenario that sent a shockwave through the small, tranquil town. The officer taking the report tried to be reassuring, speaking of typical teenage behavior, of parties and lost track of time. But 5 of them, all at once, all incommunicado? Even the most optimistic officer knew this was different. The case landed on the desk of Detective James Jim Corbin. Corbin was a man worn down by 2 decades of seeing the worst of humanity, a fact etched into the deep lines around his eyes and the permanent slump of his shoulders. He was a relic from a different era of policing, a man who trusted his gut more than algorithms, and his gut was screaming that something was terribly wrong. He'd moved to Oakhaven a few years prior for a quieter life after a high-profile case in the city had gone horribly wrong, a case that had left him with a tremor in his hand and a deep-seated distrust of his own instincts. This new case felt like a ghost from his past, a test he was terrified he would fail again. His younger, more eager partner, Detective Miller, was all procedure and protocol. We've issued a bolo for the vehicle, a 1998 Toyota Camry registered to Michael Riley, Miller reported, tapping on his tablet. We're pinging their cell phones, but all 5 are showing as offline since approximately 2:15 a.m. Last known tower they pinged was the one on Miller's Ridge. Corbin's head snapped up. Miller's Ridge overlooked the entire valley, including the wooded hills to the north. Hills that held only one landmark of note. Blackwood, Corbin said, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. He ignored Miller's skeptical look and pulled up a map, drawing a radius from the cell tower. The abandoned sanatorium sat squarely within it. It was a long shot, a wild guess based on a ghost story, but it was the only thing he had. Get a couple of patrol cars out to the access road, he ordered. Tell them to look for the Camry. An hour later, the call came in. A patrol officer had found the car, tucked away in an overgrown clearing, just as Corbin had predicted. It was locked. There were no signs of a struggle. Inside, on the passenger seat, was a half-eaten bag of gummy bears and a copy of The Bell Jar. It was as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a walk and intended to return. But the woods that stretched out before the car led to only one place. Corbin and Miller arrived on the scene as a search team was being assembled. The autumn air, so full of promise the day before, now felt heavy and ominous. Corbin's gaze was fixed on the silhouette of the sanatorium on the hill, a jagged wound in the skyline. He could feel the old, familiar dread coiling in his stomach. He had hoped he would never have to feel it again. The search began with a methodical sweep of the grounds. Uniformed officers fanned out, their voices cutting through the eerie silence as they called the girls' names. Maya, Chloe, Lily. The only reply was the rustle of leaves and the cawing of distant crows. They found the bent section of the fence, the unofficial entrance. Footprints were visible in the soft mud around it, Small sneaker prints, jumbled and overlapping. They had gone inside. Protocol dictated they wait for a full tactical team before entering an unsecured, derelict building, but Corbin couldn't wait. He looked at the dark, gaping maw of the side entrance and knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the answers were in there. "Miller with me?" he said, pulling a heavy flashlight from his belt. "Everyone else, secure the perimeter." The interior of Blackwood was even worse than the stories described. The air was thick with the dust of ages and the stench of mildew and rot. Sunlight struggled to pierce the grime-caked windows, creating ghostly shafts of light in the gloom. Furniture lay overturned and broken, covered in shrouds of dust. Graffiti, some of it decades old, covered the peeling walls like desperate, silent screams. They moved slowly, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They checked every room on the ground floor, their boots crunching on fallen plaster and shattered glass. In what might have been a common room, they found the first sign of the girls. A single, discarded candy wrapper lying in the center of the floor. It felt like a deliberate breadcrumb, a tiny, mundane object screaming that they had been there. They continued their search, their calls echoing unanswered through the cavernous halls. The building itself seemed to groan around them, the settling of a dying beast. They found nothing else on the first or second floors. No backpacks, no discarded clothing, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the building had swallowed them whole. It was Miller who found it. He was sweeping his light along the base of the grand, decaying staircase in the main foyer when he stopped. "Detective," he called out, his voice hushed. "Over here." Tucked away in the dark recess beneath the stairs, almost as if it had been placed there, was a black camera bag. Corbin's heart leaped into his throat. He knelt down, his bad knee protesting. The bag was clean, free of the thick dust that coated everything else. He carefully unzipped it. Inside, nestled in padded compartments, were a spare lens, a battery pack, and a DSLR camera. He picked it up. It was a Canon, a high-quality model. On the side, a small piece of tape bore a neatly written name, Chloe Chun. Corbin turned the camera over in his hands. It was cold to the touch. The lens cap was on. There was a small, ugly crack in the corner of the LCD screen, and a smudge of what looked like dirt or dried mud near the shutter button. He pressed the power button. Nothing. The battery was dead. "Let's get this back to the station," Corbin said, his voice grim. "Get the tech guys to charge it. I want to see what's on that memory card." As they stepped back outside into the fading afternoon light, the oppressive weight of the sanatorium seemed to lift, but the cold dread remained. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The tech analyst managed to power the camera using a universal charger. The memory card was thankfully undamaged. Corbin stood behind the analyst, Miller at his side, as the man inserted the card into a reader and clicked open the folder. Dozens of video files appeared on the screen, labeled with dates and times. The last file was timestamped at 1:58 a.m. that morning. It was significantly larger than the others. "This is it," the analyst said. "Files intact." "Play it," Corbin commanded, his voice barely a whisper. The analyst double-clicked the file. The screen flickered to life. The first image was blurry, shot from a low angle, showing the decaying, water-stained ceiling of a dark room. Then, the sound kicked in the terrified, ragged breathing of 5 girls, the frantic shuffling of feet on a debris-strewn floor, and a high-pitched, inhuman scream that seemed to tear through the speakers. And then, from the darkness, a voice, choked with terror, screamed a single, chilling word. "Run!" The screen went black. The file had ended. But for Detective Corbin, the nightmare had just begun. The silence in the evidence review room was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the computer tower. Detective Corbin stared at the black screen, the final, terrified scream still echoing in the space between his ears. Miller let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Play it again," Corbin said, his voice a low rasp, "from the beginning of the footage from that night." The tech analyst clicked back through the files, finding the first clip recorded inside the sanatorium. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m. Corbin pulled a chair closer, leaning forward, his entire world narrowing to the glowing rectangle of the monitor. He was no longer a detective in a sterile office. He was a ghost, a silent observer stepping into Blackwood with 5 girls who had no idea they were walking to their doom. The footage began shakily, the camera pointed at the floor as Chloe adjusted her settings. "Okay, rolling," her voice said, clinical and steady. Blackwood Sanatorium, 11:42 p.m. Subjects are jumpy. The camera panned up. The beams from their 5 flashlights cut wildly through the oppressive darkness of the entrance hall, like searchlights looking for a stage. "Don't call us subjects," Maya's voice shot back, though she was smiling, her face half illuminated and looking thrilled. "Call us pioneers. Call us idiots," Jess muttered from the edge of the frame. Lily was standing close to Ava, her flashlight beam trembling, tracing the peeling paint on the walls. "It feels cold in here," she whispered. "It's an old building with no insulation, Lily," Chloe's voiceover explained patiently. "It's called thermodynamics." Corbin watched, utterly captivated, as the girls began their exploration. The first 20 minutes were exactly what one would expect. A mix of nervous giggling, false bravado, and teenage banter. They explored the ground floor, peering into empty patient rooms, their lights revealing rusted bed frames and piles of debris. Maya dared Jess to lie on an old operating table they found in what must have been the surgical ward, which Jess refused with a creatively obscene gesture. Chloe kept a running commentary, debunking every strange noise as wind or settling foundations. Yet, even through the lens of her skepticism, the atmosphere was undeniably tense. The sheer scale of the decay, the profound and utter silence of the place, was unsettling. Corbin made the tech analyst pause the footage frequently. "Go back 10 seconds, he'd command. "Listen." In the background, beneath their laughter, he could hear it. A faint, whisper-like sound, too indistinct to be a voice, but present nonetheless. "It's just audio artifacting, probably," the analyst suggested. "Maybe," Corbin said, but his gut told him otherwise. The first truly unexplainable event happened about 30 minutes into the footage. The girls were in a large, dilapidated day room. "Okay, according to Lily's ghost blog," Chloe said, panning the camera around the room, "this is where patients would report seeing shadow figures darting in the corners. They said it was a sign of Dr. Blackwood's presence," Lily added, her voice shaky. Suddenly, from down the long, dark hallway they had just come from, came the distinct metallic slam of a heavy door. The girls froze, their flashlight beams all snapping in the direction of the sound. "What was that?" Ava whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Probably a door the wind caught," Chloe said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She zoomed the camera down the hallway. It was empty. The door they had entered through at the end of the hall was now visibly closed. "Didn't we leave that open?" Jess asked, her nonchalant facade beginning to crack. I thought so," Maya said, her bravado faltering for the first time. Corbin felt a cold chill. There was no wind inside the sealed building. From there, the tenor of the footage shifted. The nervous excitement curdled into genuine fear. The girls stuck closer together, speaking in hushed tones. Lily was becoming visibly distressed, clutching the pouch of salt in her pocket. They decided to head upstairs, their footsteps echoing on the grand, decaying staircase. On the second floor, they found the administrative wing. In a large, oak-paneled office, presumably Dr. Blackwood's, they found a treasure trove of decay. A massive desk lay overturned, and patient files were strewn across the floor, their pages turned to a brittle, yellowed mush by years of damp. Chloe's camera zoomed in on one of the files. The patient's name was Eleanor Vance, and the diagnosis read, hysterical melancholia. The doctor's notes were chilling. Patient exhibits extreme fear response. Believes a man made of shadow follows her. An ideal candidate for Procedure 7, the fear extraction. "This is sick," Ava said, looking away. As Lily read the passage aloud, A small, round object rolled out from under the desk and came to a stop near her foot. It was a child's marble. The girls stared at it. Okay. Scientifically, Chloe began, her voice strained. The floor is probably just uneven, but the floor was perfectly level. No one had touched the desk. The marble had come from nowhere. That was when they began to turn on each other. The oppressive atmosphere was amplifying their own fears and insecurities. This was a stupid idea, Maya, Jess snapped, her voice sharp with fear masked as anger. You were the one who wanted to come, Maya retorted, her own fear making her defensive. Stop it, you guys, Ava pleaded, but her voice was lost in the rising tension. Lily, meanwhile, was staring into a dark corner of the office, her eyes wide with terror. He's here, she whispered, her body trembling violently. The Shadow Man. I can feel him. Chloe swung the camera to the corner. There was nothing there but peeling wallpaper and cobwebs. Lily, there's nothing there, she said, trying to sound reassuring. But then, for a split second, a flicker on the screen. A distortion. Corbin yelled, "Freeze it!" The analyst froze the frame. In the corner, almost imperceptible, was a dark shape, taller and straighter than any shadow the furniture could cast. It had no discernible features, but it was unmistakably the silhouette of a tall, thin man. My God, Miller breathed. Enhance that, Corbin ordered. But the shape was low resolution, a smudge of pixels. As the video played in slow motion, the shape was there for 2 frames and then it was gone. The girls hadn't seen it, but Lily had felt it. She was now in the grip of a full-blown panic attack, sobbing and hyperventilating. The group decided to leave. This was the turning point in the footage, the moment the adventure died and the nightmare truly began. But in their panic, they became disoriented. They took a wrong turn, ending up in a part of the building they hadn't been in before, the West Wing, the part that had been gutted by fire. The scenery became hellish. The walls were scorched black, and the air was thick with the smell of old smoke. They found their way to a stairwell leading down. A sign on the wall, barely legible through the soot, read, Sublevel B, Experimental Ward. This is where he did it, Lily sobbed. Procedure 7. Against their better judgment, driven by a morbid curiosity and a desperate search for an exit, they went down. The basement was a labyrinth of damp, narrow corridors and small, horrifying rooms. These weren't patient rooms. They were cells with thick metal doors and small, barred windows. In the center of the ward, they found a large, tiled room that looked like an operating theater. In the middle of the room was a single, terrifying object. A metal chair with leather straps at the wrists, ankles, and forehead, surrounded by strange, archaic-looking electrical equipment. It was here that the footage descended into absolute chaos. The camera was pointed at the chair when all their flashlights, in unison, began to flicker violently. What's happening? Ava screamed. The audio on the camera filled with a deafening blast of static. Through the static, Corbin could hear whispers, dozens of them, overlapping and frantic. They were the voices of men, women, children, all whispering in terror. The girls were screaming now, their flashlight beams strobing across the room, illuminating brief, terrifying tableaus. For a moment, the camera caught Jess's face, her eyes wide not with fear, but with a horrifying, vacant resignation. Then it caught Maya, pulling on a door that wouldn't budge. Then, the lights went out completely, plunging the camera's view into total darkness. But the audio continued. There was screaming, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the tiled floor, and a wet, tearing sound that made Corbin's blood run cold. A voice rose above the din, clear and articulate, right next to the camera's microphone. It wasn't one of the girls. It was a man's voice, calm and clinical, like a doctor dictating notes. Subject 5 exhibits extreme terror response, the voice said. The echo is strong in this one. Commencing extraction. There was a final, blood-curdling scream. Corbin thought it might have been Chloe Sand, the sound of the camera hitting the floor. The view was now sideways, showing only a small patch of the grimy floor. A pair of worn leather shoes walked into the frame, stopping inches from the lens. Then, a slender, long-fingered hand reached down. The screen flickered. The last image, burned into the footage for a single frame, was a face leaning down towards the camera. It was pale and gaunt, with deep-set, impossibly dark eyes that seemed to stare directly at Corbin through the screen. It was a face of pure, malevolent intelligence. Then the footage cut to black. The file ended. Corbin sat back, his body cold and his hands shaking. He had watched the last hour of 5 girls' lives. He hadn't seen a crime of opportunity or a simple kidnapping. He had seen a hunt. And the monster from Oakhaven's ghost stories was real. And it had left a witness. In the weeks that followed the viewing of the footage, a chilling quiet descended upon the investigation. The video was a paradox. It was the most damning piece of evidence Corbin had ever seen, yet it was utterly useless. He couldn't show it to the public. He couldn't present it in a court of law. How could he issue an arrest warrant for a shadow? How could he tell 5 grieving families that their daughters had been taken by a ghost from a local legend? The official narrative, crafted by Chief Harris for public consumption, was that the girls were considered endangered runaways, and that the footage showed them in a state of distress before they disappeared, possibly after encountering an unknown assailant in the sanatorium. A forensic team swept Blackwood from top to bottom. They found nothing. No blood, no DNA, no fingerprints other than those of the girls and dozens of other trespassers over the years. They found no hidden rooms, no secret passages. The sanatorium kept its secrets locked tight. The case, for all its initial terrifying momentum, hit a wall of solid, inexplicable mystery. For Detective Miller and the rest of the department, the trail went cold. They followed up on dead-end leads, interviewing local vagrants and known offenders, but their hearts weren't in it. They had seen the footage. They knew this wasn't a normal case. The fear in the evidence room had spread through the precinct, a quiet, unspoken dread that made them avoid Corbin's gaze and change the subject whenever Blackwood was mentioned. But for Corbin, the trail was scorching hot. It had burned itself into his brain. He couldn't stop seeing the gaunt, pale face in that final frame. He couldn't unhear the calm, clinical voice talking about extraction. He became obsessed. He converted a corner of his office into a Blackwood command center, pinning crime scene photos, building schematics, and stills from the video onto a large corkboard. The terrified faces of the 5 girls stared back at him, a silent jury to his frustrating lack of progress. His life outside the case dissolved. He stopped sleeping, surviving on stale coffee and a gnawing sense of responsibility. The tremor in his hand returned with a vengeance. He watched the footage over and over again, dozens of times, until he had memorized every scream, every shadow, every line of dialogue. He wasn't just investigating a crime anymore. He was living in it. He felt like he knew the girls. Maya's reckless bravery, Chloe's desperate attempts at logic, Lily's terrifying sensitivity, Ava's gentle fear, and Jess's broken-hearted defiance. He had failed to save a child once before, the case that had shattered his career in the city. He would not let it happen again. His obsession led him down a rabbit hole of historical research. He spent his days off at the Oakhaven County Archive, a dusty, forgotten room in the basement of the library, poring over old town records and brittle, yellowed newspapers from the 1920s. He was searching for Dr. Alistair Blackwood. He found the official records easily enough. A brilliant, wealthy physician from Boston who had opened the Blackwood Sanatorium in 1921 as a state-of-the-art facility for the mentally afflicted. But then he started finding the unofficial stories. Whispers in old newspaper editorials about controversial methods. Letters to the editor from concerned citizens about the high mortality rate at the sanatorium. He found a notice of a formal investigation in 1928, an investigation that was abruptly closed with no findings released to the public. And then, in the winter of 1929, the fire that gutted the West Wing. The official cause was faulty wiring. But Corbin found a small, buried article from a rival town's newspaper that quoted an unnamed firefighter who claimed the fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously, and that there had been no bodies found in the experimental ward, despite records indicating it was full of patients at the time. The real breakthrough came when he found the personal effects of a retired town clerk, donated to the archive after his death. Tucked away in a box of old land deeds was a small, leather-bound journal. It belonged to a nurse named Agnes McCready, who had worked at Blackwood from 1925 to 1928. Her entries, written in a neat, looping cursive, began with optimism and descended into stark terror. She described Dr. Blackwood not as a healer, but as a physicist of the soul. He wasn't trying to cure fear, he was trying to harness it. He calls it psychic resonance, Agnes wrote. He believes that an intense emotional event, particularly terror, can leave an echo, a permanent imprint on a physical location. He says the sanatorium is not just a building, but a vessel, an antenna he is tuning. She wrote about Procedure 7. It wasn't a surgery. It was a ritual. Blackwood would use a combination of psychoactive drugs, sensory deprivation, and electrical stimulation to induce a state of absolute, primal terror in his patients. He believed that in this state, their fear echo could be extracted and stored, like electricity in a battery. The chair Corbin had seen in the footage was not for treatment. It was a device for harvesting. The final entries were frantic and terrified. The patients who undergo the procedure, they come back empty. Their bodies are here, but their spirits are gone. At night, I hear their voices whispering from the walls of the ward. The building is alive with their pain. Eleanora Vance, the poor girl, she saw him for what he was. She said he didn't cast a shadow. She said he was a shadow. After her treatment, she simply faded. She was there one day and gone the next. Dr. Blackwood says I am hysterical. He says I would be an ideal candidate. The last entry was short and scrawled. He knows I have been writing this. He is coming for me. God help me. There were no more entries. Corbin checked the town's death records. Agnes McCready was listed as having died of Spanish influenza in 1928, but Corbin knew that was a lie. He now understood. Blackwood hadn't created a ghost. He had become one. Through his monstrous experiments, he had transformed himself and his sanatorium into a single parasitic entity that fed on fear. It was a trap designed to lure people in, amplify their terror, and then harvest the echo. The 5 girls hadn't just been killed. Their final moments of terror were now a part of the building, replaying for eternity, a source of power for the thing that called itself Blackwood. The girls weren't just gone. They were fuel. A cold, grim certainty settled over Corbin. The official investigation was useless. There was no human culprit to catch. He closed the journal, the dry leather cracking under his fingers. He knew what he had to do. The police couldn't stop it. The law couldn't touch it. But maybe, just maybe, he could. He couldn't save the girls, not anymore. But he could stop the harvest. He could burn the field. He stood up, the tremor in his hand miraculously gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He was going back to Blackwood, and this time he was going alone. Corbin chose the hour just before dawn to make his return, a time when the world held its breath between the deepest dark and the first hint of light. He didn't go as a police officer. He left his badge and service weapon locked in his desk. He went as a man with a singular, desperate purpose. In the trunk of his car were not evidence kits, but 3 large cans of gasoline and a road flare. He was not going to investigate. He was going to perform an exorcism with fire. The sanatorium was a black maw against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. As he slipped through the familiar gap in the fence, the air grew colder, the silence more profound. It was a dead silence, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something that consumed it. The building was waiting for him. It knew he was there. He entered through the same side door the girls had, his heavy-duty flashlight cutting a clean, powerful beam through the gloom. The interior was unchanged, a perfect monument to decay. But this time Corbin felt a difference. The air was charged, electric with a malevolent awareness. The whispers started almost immediately, not the faint, ambiguous sounds from the camera's audio, but clear, distinct voices that seemed to slither out of the walls. "You can't save them, James," a voice hissed, sounding like his old captain from the city. "You'll fail just like you did with the boy." The memory hit him like a physical blow. The face of the young boy in the hostage situation, the case that had broken him. He stumbled, leaning against a wall, his heart pounding. The entity was in his head. It was sifting through his memories, pulling out his deepest fears and failures, using them as weapons. This was its game. It didn't need to create fear. It just needed to reflect his own. "She never loved you," a soft, feminine voice whispered, the voice of his ex-wife. "She left because you are empty inside." "Shut up," Corbin growled into the darkness, pushing himself off the wall. "You're just an echo. You're nothing." He gripped his flashlight tighter, its solid weight a comforting anchor to reality. He would not give it the fear it craved. He made his way through the building with a grim determination, ignoring the phantom footsteps that dogged his path and the shadowy figures that darted at the edge of his vision. His destination was the sublevel, the heart of the darkness. As he descended the soot-stained stairs, the whispers grew into a cacophony, a chorus of pain and terror, the voices of Blackwood's victims, the echoes he had harvested for decades. The experimental ward was colder than the rest of the building, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to leach the warmth from his bones. In the center of the tiled operating theater stood the chair, a grim throne waiting for its next occupant. And standing beside it was a tall, thin figure, a silhouette of pure darkness, more solid and defined than the flicker he had seen in the video. Dr. Alistair Blackwood. "Detective?" the voice from the footage said, echoing not from the figure, but from all around him. It was calm, curious, and utterly devoid of humanity. "You have returned. An unexpected variable. You do not feel like the others. Your fear is old, stale." "I'm not here to be a part of your collection," Corbin said, his voice steady, refusing to show the terror that was trying to claw its way up his throat. Suddenly, the room changed. He was no longer in the sanatorium. He was back in that sweltering warehouse 10 years ago. He could smell the gunpowder and the coppery scent of blood. The hostage-taker was shouting. The boy was crying. He saw himself younger and more arrogant, making the wrong call, giving the order to breach. He saw the flash of the gunshot, the boy falling. The weight of his failure crashed down on him, an agony as fresh as it was a decade ago. Such a powerful echo. Blackwood's voice purred with delight. So much regret, so much fear of failure. "Give it to me." Corbin was on his knees, gasping for air, the illusion utterly, terrifyingly real. He was drowning in his own past. This was how the entity won. It didn't kill you with shadows. It made you kill yourself with your own regrets. But then, through the haze of his personal hell, he saw them. The faint, shimmering outlines of 5 girls, standing near the far wall. Maya, Chloe, Lily, Ava, and Jess. They were pale and translucent, their faces locked in the same expressions of terror he'd seen in the footage. They were the entity's prize trophies, their echoes trapped in a perpetual loop of their final moments. But as Corbin looked at them, he saw something else in their eyes. A plea. Not for rescue, but for release. That sight broke the spell. His own pain, his own failure, seemed insignificant compared to their stolen futures. He wasn't the broken detective from the city anymore. He was the only one who could end this. He got to his feet, the illusion of the warehouse shattering around him, the decaying walls of the operating theater snapping back into place. He looked directly at the shadow figure. "You're right," Corbin said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength. "My fear is old, and I'm tired of it. It doesn't own me anymore." He held the entity's gaze, not with aggression, but with a profound and utter lack of fear. He offered it nothing. No terror, no regret, no anger. Just an empty, hollow refusal. The effect was instantaneous. The shadow figure seemed to recoil, to shrink, as if it had touched something searingly hot. The cacophony of whispers faltered, replaced by a sound of surprise, of frustration. The entity was starving. "What are you doing?" the voice hissed. a note of panic creeping in for the first time. "I'm ending you," Corbin said simply. He uncapped the first can of gasoline and began to splash it across the floor, the acrid smell a perfume of cleansing. He doused the chair, the walls, the archaic equipment. The translucent figures of the girls flickered, their expressions seeming to soften, as if they knew what was coming. The shadow figure lunged at him, no longer a calm observer but a desperate, cornered animal. But it had no physical substance. Its form passed through him with a blast of icy cold, a futile spectral attack. It had no power over someone who was not afraid. Corbin emptied the last can, backed out of the room, and pulled the road flare from his jacket. He struck the cap, and it ignited with a brilliant, hissing red light. For a moment, the sanatorium was illuminated in a hellish, crimson glow. He looked at the flickering apparitions of the 5 girls one last time and gave a small, solemn nod. He tossed the flare into the room. The world erupted in a roar of fire and heat. The gasoline ignited with a concussive humph, and flames devoured the experimental ward, feasting on the dry, ancient rot. A piercing, inhuman shriek echoed through the building, a sound of 1,000 voices crying out in unison as the psychic energy that held them captive was consumed by the fire. It was the sound of the sanatorium dying. Corbin didn't wait to watch. He turned and ran, climbing the stairs as the fire raged below, the heat chasing him up the stairwell. He burst out of the side door and into the cool, clean air of the dawn, not stopping until he was back at the tree line, his lungs heaving. He turned and watched as Blackwood Sanatorium burned. The fire spread with unnatural speed, consuming the entire structure in a vortex of orange and black. It was more than a building burning. It was a century of pain being cauterized from the world. The mystery of the 5 vanished girls was never officially solved. Their bodies were never found. To the world, they remained a tragic, unanswered question. But Corbin knew the truth. He hadn't saved them, but he had freed them. Their echoes were finally silent. Years later, the hill where Blackwood stood is now a meadow, covered in wildflowers. The town of Oakhaven healed, though the scar of the memory remained. Detective Corbin retired, a quiet man who was no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past. Sometimes, on a crisp October evening, he would drive by the meadow, and he would remember the 5 girls not as victims, but as the pioneers Maya had wanted them to be, the ones whose tragic journey had finally led to the end of a monster. The fear was gone. Only the echoes of their memory remained.